They thought freedom was within their grasp. 8 fugitives. They had planned every detail: the stolen vehicle, the hidden safe houses, the new identities waiting just across the border. They were willing to do anything to disappear. That's why, when they came across a lone woman running the trails, they didn't hesitate. She was just another victim, just another pawn in their escape. Bruised and exhausted, she looked like an easy target. But appearances can be deceiving. They had no idea they had just taken a Delta Force commander with over 20 successful missions in the most grueling war zones in the world. What started as a simple kidnapping would unravel into a nationwide manhunt, turning hunter into hunted as she clawed her way back from the brink. The men who once felt invincible would watch their carefully laid plans crumble, their safe houses compromised, their allies dismantled one by one. This isn't just the story of a woman surviving against impossible odds. This is the story of how 8 ruthless criminals thought they had won, until they realized they had kidnapped the worst possible person. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. Naomi Cole pushed herself harder as she ran along the dirt trail, keeping a steady rhythm. She had been on the trail for over an hour, the crisp morning air filling her lungs as she maintained her pace. The national park stretched for miles in every direction, with nothing but dense forest around her. It was peaceful, isolated. That isolation had been part of the appeal. She had spent years in the military, always surrounded by people, never able to let her guard down. Running gave her the space she needed, a time to think, a time to forget. But something felt wrong. She caught a glimpse of movement to her right, a shadow slipping between the trees. She didn't react, keeping her breathing controlled, her pace steady. She wasn't armed, wasn't expecting trouble, but she had learned to trust her instincts. The forest had been alive with the sounds of birds and insects just minutes ago. Now it was silent. Ahead, off the trail, a black SUV was parked at an awkward angle near the tree line. The driver's door was open. She slowed, pretending to check her watch. The vehicle was covered in dust, the license plate barely visible. There was no one inside, but she could see movement near the trees, more than one person. Then she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned, and a man was already lunging at her. Naomi shifted her weight and sidestepped, letting him stumble forward. He was tall, thick arms covered in tattoos, his face sunburned and unshaven. She barely had time to register him before 2 more men emerged from the trees, blocking the trail. Another stepped out from behind the SUV. There were 8 of them in total. She sized them up quickly. Prison uniforms, torn and dirty, mixed with stolen civilian clothes. Some carried makeshift weapons, pipes, a crowbar, a hunting knife. They looked like they had been on the run for days. But that didn't make them any less dangerous. A man with slicked-back hair stepped forward. He was leaner than the others, but there was confidence in the way he carried himself. He smirked. "No need to run. You're exactly what we needed." Naomi's muscles tensed. She didn't know who they were or what they wanted. But one thing was clear. They had been waiting for her. She wasn't going to let them take her without a fight. Naomi kept her stance neutral, her breathing steady, but her mind was already analyzing the situation. 8 men, all rough, all tense, all expecting her to react a certain way. They had her surrounded, cutting off the path ahead and blocking her retreat behind. It wasn't a sloppy formation, but it wasn't professional either. These weren't trained men. They were hardened by something else. Prison. The leader stepped forward, just enough to establish himself as the one in charge. He was lean, his slicked-back hair and worn leather jacket giving him the look of someone who thought he was untouchable. The way the others lingered behind him, waiting for his reaction, told her everything she needed to know. He was the one calling the shots. "You're a long way from help," he said smoothly. His voice was calm, almost friendly. But Naomi knew better than to be fooled by that kind of tone. "Ain't exactly a good place to be alone, wouldn't you say?" Naomi didn't flinch, didn't look away. She had spent too much time in too many dangerous places to be intimidated by a few men who thought their numbers made them powerful. "Seems to me you're the ones with the problem," she said evenly. A few of them chuckled at that, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't reach their eyes. The leader smirked, tilting his head slightly. "You don't know what's going on, do you?" He gestured lazily toward the SUV parked near the trees. "Take a guess." She didn't need to. She had already figured it out. "You broke out of prison," she said. The smirk widened. "That's right. 8 of us. Fresh out. And wouldn't you know it, the whole damn state is on high alert. Cops everywhere. Roadblocks. Patrols. Ain't exactly the kind of welcome wagon we were hoping for. And I'm supposed to care because—" The man's grin stretched wider. But there was a sharpness behind it now. "Because we need a way through. We need someone to help us pass the roadblocks. Past the cops. And look at that. Right place. Right time." One of the other men, a stocky guy with a crooked nose and a fading black eye, crossed his arms. "I still think we should just take her stuff and move on." "You think we're just gonna walk through a roadblock looking like this?" The leader shot back, waving at their mismatched stolen clothing and prison tattoos. "We need a damn reason to be there. She's it. She's a runner," another man muttered, eyeing Naomi. He had a sunburnt face and a thin, wiry build, the kind of guy who had been surviving on his nerves alone. "She ain't gonna get us past cops. She ain't just a runner," a deeper voice rumbled. Naomi turned her head slightly toward the one who had spoken. A massive man with a thick build and a shaved head. He was bigger than the others, broader, the kind of person who didn't need to carry a weapon, because his body was the weapon. He had been watching her closely, and Naomi knew exactly what he had seen. The way she had kept her feet positioned, the way she hadn't panicked, the way she had sized them up the moment they surrounded her. He had picked up on it. The leader turned to him. "Something you want to share, Brick?" The big man, Travis Brick Walker, didn't take his eyes off Naomi. "She's not scared." The others didn't seem to know what to make of that. Naomi stayed quiet, letting the moment settle, letting them wrestle with the fact that she wasn't reacting the way they expected. "Don't matter," the leader said after a moment, brushing it off. "She don't gotta be scared. She just has to cooperate." Naomi exhaled slowly. "And if I don't?" The leader sighed, running a hand through his slicked-back hair. "Lady, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Naomi didn't move. "That's not an answer." The leader was about to respond when one of the men, a younger guy with nervous energy radiating off him, took a step forward. "What if she tells the cops?" His voice had an edge of panic in it. "What if she gives us up?" The leader turned his head slightly, looking at him over his shoulder. "You planning to let her go?" The younger man hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm just saying, man. This is stupid. This ain't part of the plan. We were supposed to get out, lay low, find a way to move without heat. This is asking for heat. She's our way through," the leader repeated, his voice losing patience. "We take her. We use her to get past the roadblocks. Then we dump her. Simple. Dump her where?" The younger man's voice wavered slightly. The leader turned fully now, his posture shifting, his smirk gone. "You ask too many damn questions." The nervous guy swallowed hard, but didn't argue further. Naomi was watching closely, listening to every shift in tone, every crack in their unity. The younger one was afraid. He wasn't fully committed to this. That meant weakness. "Look," the leader said, turning back to Naomi. "This don't gotta be a fight. You walk with us nice and easy. Nobody gets hurt. We get through the roadblock, and you go on your way." Naomi didn't believe that for a second. She had been in situations like this before, had heard variations of that same line. It was never that simple. "Or," the leader continued, "you can make this real messy, real fast." Naomi kept her breathing steady. She could feel the tension settling around them, a charged moment where everything could shift in an instant. They were waiting for her to react, waiting for her to show fear or compliance. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, meeting the leader's gaze head-on. "I think we both know I'm not going anywhere with you." Silence stretched between them. The leader clicked his tongue, shaking his head like she had just disappointed him. "Shame," he murmured. Then, without warning, one of the men lunged. The second the man lunged, Naomi moved. She twisted her body just as his arms reached for her, sidestepping smoothly as his momentum carried him past. His balance was off, and she took advantage of it instantly, slamming her elbow into the side of his jaw. His head snapped back violently, and before he could recover, she followed up with a quick, precise strike to his throat. He let out a choked gasp as his legs buckled beneath him, collapsing face first into the dirt. For half a second, there was silence. Then everything exploded at once. "Get her!" Naomi was already moving, her body twisting as another man grabbed at her from the side. She wrenched her arm free and drove her knee into his stomach, feeling his breath rush out as he doubled over. Before he could recover, she brought both hands down in a sharp hammer strike to the back of his neck, sending him sprawling forward. He hit the ground, groaning, but she didn't stop to see if he got up. She was already sprinting. She wasn't trying to escape. She knew they'd chase her no matter what, but they were bunched together, trying to grab her all at once. She needed space, needed to isolate them. The forest was dense, but the trail was narrow, lined with thick trees and uneven terrain. Naomi used it to her advantage, cutting sharp angles, darting between trunks, forcing them to react instead of plan. She could hear them shouting, crashing through the underbrush after her. "Cut her off! Move your ass! She's getting away!" A branch snapped to her right. Naomi turned just as a stocky man, Rust, the one with the busted lip, lunged from the side. She reacted instantly, planting her foot and dropping low, sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard with a strangled grunt, and Naomi was already moving again before he could recover. Footsteps pounded behind her, and she heard the unmistakable sound of breathing too close. She ducked as an arm swung toward her head. Barely missing, she twisted, driving her elbow into the attacker's ribs. He grunted, staggering back, but another pair of hands reached for her from the other side. She spun away, moving fast, but they were adjusting now, trying to predict her movements. "She's too fast!" someone shouted. "Shut up and grab her!" Naomi saw the tree line ahead breaking into a small clearing, just enough space for them to spread out again. She had to make a choice: stay in the thick of the woods and keep moving, or turn and take another one down before they boxed her in. A shadow shifted in the trees ahead. Someone was trying to get in front of her. She didn't stop running, but she adjusted her course, angling slightly to the left. The second she broke through the clearing, she saw the man waiting for her. Thin, wiry, sunburnt, his stance tense but unsteady, slim. He had positioned himself to cut her off, but he wasn't ready for how fast she closed the distance. Naomi feinted left, forcing him to react, then snapped her foot into his knee. He yelped, stumbling, and she slammed her shoulder into his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Shouts rang behind her, and she knew the others were catching up fast. She turned, ready to move again, but something slammed into her side. A solid mass, all brute strength and force. Brick. The impact took her off her feet. She hit the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs as his weight bore down on her. His hands locked onto her wrists, pinning them into the dirt. "Enough of this," he growled, his grip tightening. Naomi struggled, twisting, trying to free herself, but he was too damn big, too heavy. His sheer size alone was enough to keep her locked down, no matter how well trained she was. "Don't kill her!" Vinny's voice cut through the chaos. "We need her alive!" Brick's grip didn't loosen, but he exhaled sharply, adjusting his hold. "She's got some fight," he muttered. "Almost respect it." Naomi wasn't listening. She was watching how his balance shifted slightly when he spoke, how he eased up just enough now that he thought she was done. She forced her body to go slack, just a little, just enough to make him think she was giving up. It took less than a second. Brick shifted his weight slightly, and Naomi reacted instantly. She snapped her hips up, twisting hard, throwing her full weight into the movement. His balance faltered, just enough for her to rip one arm free. She rammed her forearm into his throat, making him jerk back instinctively. His hold loosened, and she threw her knee into his ribs as hard as she could. Brick grunted, recoiling. But she wasn't free yet. Hands grabbed her from behind, yanking her upright before she could fully escape. She lashed out, twisting her body. But there were too many of them now. Too many hands pulling, grabbing, holding her down. She kicked out, catching one of them in the shin, but it wasn't enough. She had hurt them, had made them work for it. But now, they had her. Vinny stepped forward, brushing off his jacket, watching her with mild amusement as she stood there, breathing hard, muscles still coiled like she might lash out again. "You're making this real difficult, lady," he said, shaking his head. "Ain't no point in fighting now. You're coming with us. That's all there is to it." Naomi said nothing. She just kept breathing, kept watching, kept waiting. They had her for now, but they hadn't won yet. Naomi kept her breathing controlled, ignoring the burn in her muscles as she stared down the drop ahead. The rock face was steep, uneven, with jagged edges and loose dirt covering the slope. But it wasn't impossible. The landing at the bottom was rough, overgrown with thick brush and strewn with broken rock. But she could manage it. She had no choice. The sound of crashing footsteps behind her, the frantic voices of the men struggling to keep up, told her exactly how close they were. "She's got nowhere left to go," someone yelled, their voice breathless with exertion. She stepped back, her foot skimming the edge as she turned her head just enough to see them emerging from the trees. Vinny was in the lead, his jacket dirtied, his expression twisted with irritation. Right behind him were Brick, Rust, and Slim, all of them in varying states of exhaustion, their frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Slim's hands were still clenched around the pistol, his grip too tight, his stance nervous, while Rust was clearly favoring one side, limping slightly from where she had hit him earlier. Brick was the only one who looked completely unfazed, his steady breathing and sharp eyes making it clear he had more left in the tank than the others. Vinny came to a stop, shaking his head as he rolled his shoulders, letting the tension settle before exhaling. "You made this way harder than it needed to be. I'll give you credit for that, lady. You run like a damn deer." His voice was lighter than his expression, but the exhaustion behind it was obvious. They had all expected this to be simple, and Naomi had proven them wrong. She didn't speak, didn't react, just kept scanning their faces, watching how they shifted, how they positioned themselves. Slim was jumpy, still looking to Vinny for instruction. Rust was impatient, wanting this over with. Brick was waiting, letting them handle it, knowing if it came down to brute strength, he could step in. Vinny let out another sharp breath, adjusting his jacket as he nodded to himself. "Now, normally, this is where we'd offer you a deal. You stop fighting, you make this easy. Maybe we don't have to rough you up too much. But I think we're past that, don't you?" He took another step forward, lifting a hand toward the others without looking back. "Go on. Grab her!" The second they moved, Naomi pushed off the ground and launched herself over the edge. Shouts erupted behind her, but she was already in the air, tucking her body just as her feet hit the steep slope. The impact sent a sharp jolt through her legs, dirt and loose stone sliding beneath her. But she rolled into the motion, absorbing the force, keeping her momentum as she hit the ground hard. She felt her muscles protest, but she didn't stop. She pushed forward immediately, sprinting through the uneven terrain, forcing herself to move before they could find another way down. More shouting from above. She jumped! Go around! The terrain was rough, thick with trees and broken rock, but it gave her cover. She moved fast, weaving through the undergrowth, keeping low, listening for any sound that told her how quickly they were following. For a few seconds, it felt like she had finally bought herself some real distance. But the illusion didn't last long. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crashing through the brush sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through her. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see Brick moving through the trees at an alarming speed. He had taken the drop better than the others, his heavy frame unbothered by the rough landing, and he was gaining fast. He wasn't just running on anger or adrenaline like the others. He was methodical, efficient, tracking her like a predator that knew its prey was already exhausted. Naomi gritted her teeth, pushing harder even as her body screamed at her to stop. Ahead, a low branch stretched across her path, just high enough to use. She grabbed it without slowing down, using the momentum to swing herself forward, planting her feet on a thick tree trunk and kicking off just as Brick reached for her. He lunged, fingers brushing against the air where her arm had been. But she had already propelled herself forward, landing hard and rolling before taking off again. The forest ahead was denser, the ground uneven, the roots thick and tangled. If she could just keep going, if she could force them further away from their vehicle, further into terrain they weren't familiar with, she could shift this in her favor. A gunshot rang out. Naomi barely had time to react before bark exploded against the tree beside her, the sharp crack sending splinters flying in all directions. She didn't stop moving, throwing herself behind the nearest cover, her heart hammering as Slim's voice echoed through the trees. "You dumbass!" Vinny's voice was furious. "I said, we need her alive. I wasn't aiming at her." Slim yelled back, his voice panicked. "I was just trying to make her stop." "You keep shooting like that, you're gonna make her stop permanently." Naomi exhaled through her nose, steadying herself against the rough bark. They had a gun. That changed things. Before, she had been able to keep pushing forward, but now she had to be more careful. She wasn't trapped yet, but if they got a lucky shot or forced her into a bad position, everything would shift in their favor. She forced herself forward again, her body protesting every step. The ground beneath her was getting rockier, the trees thinning out, and that was when she saw it. A drop. The land cut off sharply just ahead, the dried-out river carving a sheer 20-foot cliff into the landscape. The bottom was jagged, filled with loose stone and thick brush, and there was no easy way down. She skidded to a stop, her breath heavy, her mind racing. She heard them closing in behind her, their footsteps thundering against the dirt. She was running out of options. She stopped! Rust's voice was closer now, his breathing ragged. "She's cornered!" Naomi turned slightly, her eyes flicking between the edge and the figures moving toward her through the trees. Vinny stepped through the undergrowth first, his smirk returning when he saw the cliff behind her. He stopped just a few feet away, glancing over the edge before shaking his head, amused. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" She clenched her fists, her muscles aching, her body screaming at her to move, but she was out of time. "All right, enough of this," Vinny muttered, waving a hand. "Brick, grab her!" She barely had time to react before Brick surged forward, his massive frame closing the distance in an instant. She twisted, trying to move, trying to throw him off, but her body was too drained, too slow. His arms locked around her, pulling her back as she fought against his grip, kicking, struggling, but he was too strong. "Finally," Rust muttered, bending over with his hands on his knees. "Can we tie her up now?" Vinny stepped forward, nodding. "Yeah, do it before she tries something else." Naomi's muscles tensed as Rust pulled a length of rope from his pocket, moving in to bind her wrists. She forced herself to breathe, forced herself to stay calm, searching for anything, any last opening she could use to break free. Nothing. She had run, had fought, had dragged them through every obstacle she could. But the exhaustion and the numbers had finally caught up to her. Vinny exhaled, brushing dirt off his jacket. "Hell of a chase. You almost made me work for it." He gave her a slow, knowing smirk. "Almost." Naomi said nothing as the rope tightened around her wrists, the rough fibers biting into her skin. She had lost this round. But she wasn't done yet. Naomi clenched her jaw as Rust yanked the rope tighter, the rough fibers digging into her wrists, securing her hands behind her back. Her breathing was steady despite the ache in her limbs, despite the exhaustion pulling at her muscles. She could feel the heat of their eyes on her, the weight of their stares filled with frustration, anger, and something darker beneath the surface. They had her now, but they weren't celebrating yet. "All right," Vinny muttered, rolling his shoulders before turning to the others. Let's get her the hell out of here. Brick tightened his grip around her arm, his strength unrelenting as he hauled her forward, dragging her across the uneven ground. Naomi's boots dug into the dirt for a moment, instinctively resisting, but the effort was wasted. She could barely keep herself upright, her body still recovering from the chase, and the last thing she needed was to burn the little energy she had left. She let them pull her along, keeping her breathing slow, forcing herself to take in every detail. The forest was still thick around them, but she could see the trail ahead breaking open, leading toward where they had left their stolen vehicle. They had been trying to get her back to it from the start. Now, they had what they wanted. Slim was still gripping the pistol, his fingers twitching around the handle as he threw wary glances in her direction. He hadn't gotten over his nerves, hadn't settled back into the same cocky ease the others had. His hands were clammy, his jaw tight. She could see it in his posture. He hadn't expected her to fight back like she had. Rust wiped the sweat from his brow, shooting Vinny a tired glare. What the hell's the plan now? That roadblock's still up, and we've wasted enough time screwing around in the woods. Vinny didn't answer right away. He walked ahead of them, leading the way back to the vehicle, his hands resting on his hips as he took a moment to think. He wasn't as calm as he was pretending to be. Naomi could see it in the way his fingers twitched slightly, in the way his shoulders stayed just a little too tense. This hadn't gone the way he planned. We'll figure it out, he said finally, his tone clipped. But we're not leaving her behind. She's still our best shot at getting through the roadblock. Rust let out a frustrated breath, shaking his head. Yeah? And what if the cops don't buy whatever story you come up with? What if they start asking questions we can't answer? Vinny stopped walking. He turned on his heel, his expression sharp as he looked Rust over. Then we make them believe us, he said simply. Or we find another way through. Either way, we're not ditching her. We've come too far for that. Naomi stayed quiet, letting the words sink in. They were keeping her alive because they still thought they could use her. That meant she had time. Not much, but enough. Brick gave her arm another sharp tug, pulling her forward, his grip a silent warning not to test him. She kept her feet moving, staying just ahead of Rust and Slim as they made their way back toward the clearing where the van sat waiting. The vehicle was parked just off the trail, partially hidden by thick brush. But now that she was closer, she could see the dents along the sides, the rust eating at the edges. It wasn't a reliable escape vehicle. She scanned the area, counting the available exits, looking for anything that could slow them down. No immediate openings, not yet. Brick shoved her toward the side door of the van, his patience wearing thin. Get in. Naomi hesitated just enough to make him scowl before stepping up into the vehicle, ducking her head as she slid onto the floor near the back. She tested the rope around her wrists as subtly as she could, feeling the knot's tightness, searching for any give in the fibers. Nothing. The others climbed in after her, slamming the door shut behind them. Vinny took the passenger seat while Rust started the engine, the low rumble vibrating through the frame. The air inside was stifling, thick with sweat and frustration. Vinny turned in his seat, his sharp gaze settling on her. You're real quiet now, he said. That's good. Means you're finally catching on. Naomi met his stare, her expression unreadable. I was just thinking. He smirked. Yeah? About what? She leaned her head back against the metal wall, keeping her voice even. How this is gonna end. For a moment, there was silence. Then Rust snorted from the driver's seat, shaking his head as he threw the van into reverse. You really think you're getting out of this, lady? Naomi didn't answer. She didn't have to. The tension settling over the group told her that the thought had already crossed their minds. They had her for now, but they were already making mistakes. She just had to be ready when the next one came. The van rattled along the uneven dirt road, the engine growling as Rust forced it over every bump and dip in the terrain. The stifling heat inside made the air thick, the combined sweat and frustration clinging to every inch of the cramped interior. Naomi kept her posture relaxed, her head resting against the cold metal wall, her wrists still tightly bound behind her. Every shift in the vehicle's movement sent a dull throb through her body, her muscles aching from the fight, the chase, the struggle. But she wasn't focused on the pain. She was focused on them. Vinny sat in the front passenger seat, one arm resting on the window as he stared out, his expression unreadable. He was deep in thought, no doubt cycling through their dwindling options. Rust was gripping the steering wheel tight, his fingers drumming anxiously against the worn leather. Slim sat on the floor near the side door, still holding the gun, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. Brick was behind Naomi, taking up more space than anyone else, his arms crossed over his chest as he kept a close eye on her. The silence stretched, thick and tense, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Slim was the first to break. "So what's the damn plan, man?" His voice was high-strung, restless, his grip tightening on the pistol. "We got past the first roadblock, but they're going to be crawling all over the highways by now. We can't just drive through another one like it's nothing." Vinny let out a slow breath, dragging his fingers down his face before shaking his head. "We'll figure it out. We still got time before we hit the next one." "Time for what?" Rust snapped, his frustration bleeding through. "Time to get caught. We can't keep screwing around. This ain't some petty little escape. We're in deep. They're not just looking for us, they're hunting us." Naomi listened carefully, keeping her eyes half-lidded, her breathing even, as if she weren't paying attention. But she was. She caught the way Rust's voice edged toward panic, the way Slim's grip twitched around the gun every time he spoke. The fractures in their group were already forming, their desperation clawing at whatever loyalty they had left. Vinny turned in his seat, his gaze sharp. "You want to panic? You want to start whining about how bad it looks? Go ahead, Rust. But unless you got a better idea, shut the hell up and let me think." Rust let out a sharp breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter, but didn't argue. Brick finally spoke, his voice slow and measured. "We still got the girl." The van hit a pothole, jostling them roughly before Rust steadied the wheel again. Brick's words hung in the air, thick with implication, and Naomi felt the shift in the atmosphere. Vinny sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Yeah. We still got her, and we still use her to get through the next blockade. That hasn't changed." Slim scoffed. "How the hell is that supposed to work? Cops ain't just gonna let us drive through with a tied-up woman in the back. You think they won't ask questions?" Vinny's smirk returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "They won't see her tied up. We clean her up, make it look like she's with us. Maybe she's a hitchhiker. Maybe she's a girlfriend. Maybe she's in on it. Doesn't matter what story we go with, long as she plays along." Naomi finally opened her eyes fully, lifting her head just slightly. "And what if I don't?" The van went quiet again. Vinny turned to look at her, his smirk twisting into something colder. "Then we make you." Naomi held his gaze, unflinching, unfazed. "You think forcing me is going to help you get past a roadblock? You really think the cops won't notice when I look like I've been in a fight for my life?" Rust scoffed. "We can clean you up, fix your face, change your clothes. It ain't that hard." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, almost curious. "And if I talk?" Slim shifted uncomfortably, his knee still bouncing, his fingers flexing against the grip of the gun. Vinny's smirk twitched, just barely, the smallest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Brick, however, didn't waver. "Then we kill you." The words landed heavy, the weight of them pressing into the already suffocating air. Slim's knee stopped bouncing. Rust exhaled sharply through his nose, his grip tightening on the wheel. Even Vinny hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing his smirk back into place. Naomi didn't flinch. She just breathed, slow and even, letting them sit with the reality of what Brick had just said. "That's the problem, isn't it?" she murmured, voice low but unwavering. "You kill me, you lose your leverage, you keep me, and I'm a liability. No matter what you do, I'm dangerous to you." Vinny exhaled, shaking his head like he was brushing it off. "You love hearing yourself talk, don't you?" Naomi didn't respond. She just sat back against the wall, letting the van's movement lull her into stillness, watching the way they shifted, the way their plan wasn't as airtight as they wanted to believe. Slim muttered something under his breath, shifting uncomfortably. Rust rubbed a hand over his face, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Vinny stayed facing forward, his gaze locked on the road, pretending he wasn't rattled. Only Brick remained the same, silent, steady, unmoved. The fractures were growing. Naomi wasn't free yet, but she wasn't beaten either. She just had to wait for the next crack to split them open. The van rocked over uneven pavement as they hit the main road, the worn-out suspension making every bump feel worse than it was. Naomi stayed still, her back pressed against the metal wall, her arms pinned behind her, but her mind was working constantly. Every shift in their tone, every flicker of uncertainty, every moment of silence between them was another crack forming. They had the numbers. They had the gun. They had her hands bound behind her back. But they weren't in control. Not really. Rust was gripping the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles pale, his shoulders tense. His earlier frustration had turned into something else. Exhaustion, maybe even doubt. Slim was still cradling the pistol, but his nervous energy wasn't fading. If anything, it was getting worse. He wasn't used to this, wasn't built for it. He was the kind of man who talked big, but folded under real pressure. Brick was unreadable, sitting with his arms crossed, his breathing steady, his presence heavy in the already cramped space. He wasn't worried about how the others were thinking. He was only focused on the task ahead. And then there was Vinny. Vinny still had his smirk, still acted like he had everything figured out. But Naomi could see the strain behind his eyes. He wasn't the leader because he was the smartest or the strongest. He was the leader because the rest of them needed someone to tell them what to do. But now that things weren't going according to plan, he was running out of ways to keep them in line. Naomi let her head tilt slightly against the metal wall, exhaling slowly, watching them. The tension in the van was thick, the hum of the road beneath them the only sound for a long time. "You're all quiet," she said finally, her voice calm, measured. "You didn't have a backup plan, did you?" Vinny didn't turn around, but she saw the way his jaw clenched. "Oh, we got plans. Just fine. Don't worry about that." "Do you?" Naomi asked, keeping her tone level. "Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you're making this up as you go." Slim let out a sharp exhale, his knee bouncing again. "Be quiet." Naomi didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes on Vinny, studying the way his fingers tapped against his thigh, like he was trying to think through the next step, while still keeping his grip on the conversation. "You got past one roadblock, but there'll be more," she continued, pushing just enough to make them shift, just enough to keep them unsteady. "Cops are already tracking you. Maybe not your van yet, but your faces are everywhere by now. You can't walk into a gas station without someone recognizing you." Rust let out a scoff from the driver's seat, but it wasn't confident. "We've handled worse." "You've handled worse in prison," Naomi corrected. "Where you knew the rules, where you had a system, people watching your back. You don't have that out here. No walls, no guards, no codes to fall back on. You're not running a gang in a controlled space anymore. You're just running." Silence. She could feel the shift happening. The way Slim's fingers twitched against the gun, the way Rust exhaled through his nose like he was trying to block out what she was saying. She knew what doubt sounded like. Vinny chuckled, low and forced. "You love the sound of your own voice, don't you?" Naomi ignored him. "You're already turning on each other." Slim shifted, his grip tightening. "That's not true." "Really?" Naomi asked, finally looking at him. "Because, from where I'm sitting, you're the one holding the gun. But you're not leading. You're not even deciding what happens next. You're just waiting to be told what to do, hoping no one notices that you're not making any choices yourself." Slim's jaw tightened, but Naomi saw the flicker of something in his expression. "He's doing fine," Rust muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Naomi turned her attention back to Vinny, watching as he exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to keep the grin on his face. "That's a nice trick," he said, shaking his head. "Trying to stir trouble. Ain't gonna work." Naomi let her lips quirk into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You sure?" The van jolted suddenly as Rust swerved to avoid a pothole, sending a hard jerk through the cabin. Naomi let her body shift with the movement, using it to test the ropes again, to see if they had loosened at all in the last hour. Still tight, still holding. But that didn't mean they were unbreakable. She kept her breathing slow, watching, waiting. "I don't care what she says," Brick muttered from behind her. His voice was calm, level, completely unbothered by everything happening around him. "We stick to the plan, get through the next roadblock. Then we figure out where we're heading after that." Vinny nodded like he agreed, but Naomi caught the flicker of something else in his expression. Brick wasn't following him. Brick was making his own calls now. Rust ran a hand down his face, shaking his head. "Yeah. And what's after that, genius? You think we just disappear? You think we get across the border and live happily ever after?" Vinny exhaled sharply. "We keep moving. That's what we do." Rust let out a dry, humorless laugh. "That's not a plan. That's just stalling. You don't know what's next, do you?" Naomi stayed silent, watching the way Rust's hands tensed on the wheel, the way Slim kept glancing between the gun and Vinny. Like he wasn't sure who to listen to anymore. She had planted the seed, and now she just had to wait. The fractures were growing. They wouldn't break yet, but soon. The van's engine droned low, a steady vibration through the floor as they rolled onto the highway. The forest was behind them now, replaced by long stretches of road cutting through open fields and scattered towns. Naomi kept her breathing steady, her wrists still bound behind her back, her shoulders tight from holding the same position for too long. Vinny hadn't spoken much since the last conversation. His smirk had faded, his mind working too hard to come up with a plan that made sense. They were closing in on the next roadblock, and they all knew it. The tension in the van had thickened, pressing down like a weight none of them could shake. Rust's grip on the wheel was stiff, his fingers wrapped too tight, his shoulders hunched like he was preparing for something to go wrong. Slim was fidgeting with the gun again, his knee bouncing, eyes darting to Naomi every few minutes like he expected her to do something. Brick, as always, sat silent, his presence more of a warning than anything else. Vinny finally exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he muttered. "We do it just like I said. We clean her up, make her look normal. No ropes, no marks, no struggle." He turned in his seat, locking eyes with Naomi. "You're gonna be in the passenger seat. You don't talk unless I say. You smile, you look calm, and you don't do anything stupid." Naomi met his gaze evenly. "And if I do?" Vinny's smirk returned, but it was smaller, more forced. "Then we'll have to make sure you don't get the chance to say anything at all." Rust scoffed under his breath, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. We're putting everything on the line for this? You really think it's gonna work?" Vinny shot him a glare. "Unless you got a better idea. Shut up and drive." Rust muttered something under his breath, but didn't argue. Naomi kept her expression unreadable, but inside, she was already adjusting her plan. This was risky, but she could work with it. They wanted her in the front seat, visible but controlled. That gave her an opening. Vinny turned back to Brick. "Untie her, but do it slow." Brick reached for the ropes, his large hands working methodically, not giving her an inch of unnecessary movement. As soon as her wrists were free, Naomi rolled her shoulders, easing the tension. But she didn't react beyond that. She kept still, knowing any sudden movement would set them on edge. Slim gripped the gun a little tighter. "I don't like this." Vinny exhaled through his nose, clearly losing patience. "You don't like anything, Slim. Just keep your head straight and let me handle it." Brick nudged Naomi forward. "Move!" She slid into the passenger seat, the stiffness in her muscles making it clear just how much time she had spent bound in the back. Vinny reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a rag. "Clean your face." Naomi took the cloth, dabbing at the dirt and sweat that had streaked across her skin from the struggle. The bruises forming along her jaw were unavoidable, but they weren't obvious enough to raise immediate suspicion. She kept her movements slow, deliberate, not making eye contact as she wiped her hands against the fabric of her pants, shaking off the last of the tension in her limbs. Slim was still muttering under his breath. "This is bad. We should have gone another way." Vinny turned in his seat, his expression tightening. "And run where? You think back roads are going to save us? We go through this roadblock, clean and easy, or we spend the next few hours trying to dodge patrols until we run out of options. So, stop talking and get ready. Rust's grip on the wheel twitched slightly, his face tight with stress, but he didn't argue. The road ahead stretched long and open, but in the distance, Naomi could already see the flashing lights, the roadblock. Vinny straightened his jacket, rolling his shoulders like he was getting into character. He glanced at Naomi, his smirk returning just enough to try and sell the illusion. "Play nice, sweetheart. We're almost home free." Naomi didn't react. She just watched the road ahead, waiting. The line of cars leading up to the blockade moved slowly, uniformed officers standing at intervals, scanning each vehicle that passed through. Some were speaking with drivers, others watching closely, looking for signs of trouble. Rust swallowed hard. "Here we go." Vinny leaned slightly toward Naomi, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "Remember, one wrong move, and you won't like what happens next." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The van rolled forward, inching closer. Naomi kept her posture relaxed, her expression neutral. Just another passenger in just another vehicle. The officer ahead waved them forward, stepping closer to the driver's side window. Rust forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Afternoon, officer." The man gave a short nod, scanning the inside of the van. "Where you folks heading? Family trip?" Vinny answered smoothly before Rust could stumble over his words. "Had to take a little detour after hitting some bad traffic earlier. You know how it is." The officer barely looked at him. His eyes had already landed on Naomi. She felt it instantly. The pause, the calculation, the slight narrowing of his gaze. She forced herself to breathe evenly, tilting her head slightly, making it seem like she was simply waiting, unconcerned. "You all right, miss?" the officer asked, his voice polite but edged with something sharper. Naomi smiled, small and effortless, tilting her shoulders just slightly toward Vinny like it was natural. "Yeah, just tired. Been on the road a while." The officer's eyes flickered toward Vinny, who gave an easy shrug. "You know how long drives get." She's not much for conversation after the first few hours. Naomi could feel Slim's tension in the back seat, could hear the barely restrained breath Rust was holding. She didn't dare look at Brick, knowing full well that his stillness was unreadable, even to her. The officer lingered a second longer, scanning the inside of the van, his gaze catching on Slim's nervous fidgeting. Naomi's heart beat steady, even as she felt Slim's fingers tightening around the pistol out of sight. If he so much as twitched wrong, this entire plan would fall apart. Another officer stepped toward the window, his voice cutting through the moment. "This the last one?" The first officer gave them one final look before nodding. "Yeah, go on through." Rust let out an audible breath as he shifted the van into drive, rolling forward at a controlled pace. Not too fast, not too slow. The second they were past the checkpoint, the atmosphere inside the van changed instantly. Vinny exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. "Told you it would work." Rust didn't answer, just focused on the road, his fingers still gripping the wheel like he was expecting something to go wrong. Slim let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. "That was way too close." Brick, as always, said nothing. Naomi sat still, her breathing even, her mind already working on what came next. They had gotten through, but they weren't safe, not yet. The van had been moving for over an hour since they passed the roadblock, and the tension inside hadn't settled. If anything, it had worsened. Naomi sat still in the passenger seat, feeling the subtle shifts in the group's dynamic. The moment they had passed through the checkpoint, Vinny had relaxed, but the others hadn't. Slim was still on edge, Rust hadn't loosened his grip on the wheel, and Brick remained unreadable as ever. But now, she could feel another presence behind her. A heavy thud sounded as someone shifted in the farthest corner of the van. Then another. She had known since the beginning there were more of them. 8 total. But she hadn't seen them all. Some had stayed hidden in the shadows, keeping quiet. Now, as the van turned down an isolated, cracked road surrounded by nothing but overgrown grass and scattered trees, the rest of them began shifting into view. Grady leaned forward first, wiry and hollow-cheeked, his fingers tapping against his knee. He gave Naomi a slow, thin smile, like he had already decided how this was going to end. Figured you'd meet the rest of us eventually. Beside him, Carl let out a slow breath, arms crossed over his broad chest, his expression unreadable. Doyle, the one with the scar down his face, barely looked at her. His knuckles were cracked, his hands resting on his lap like he was waiting for an excuse to use them. Rust glanced toward the rearview mirror, then back at Vinny. "We need to deal with her now." Slim shifted uncomfortably, his grip still tight on the gun in his lap. "We should have left her in the woods back there. Now we're stuck with her." Naomi didn't move, didn't react, just listened. Vinny exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "Relax. We're almost done here." Rust let out a frustrated breath. "You think she's just gonna sit quiet after we let her go? She knows too much." Naomi caught the slight shift in the van, the way Slim stiffened, the way Carl and Doyle exchanged a brief glance. Grady chuckled under his breath. "She's got a point, though. You really gonna let her walk away?" Slim swallowed hard, his knee bouncing again. "We don't have to." Rust shot him a glare. "You gonna be soft now?" Vinny let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming against his thigh as he thought it over. "I'm not worried about her talking. By the time she gets anywhere, we'll be long gone. Unless someone finds her first," Carl muttered. Rust turned in his seat, his frustration boiling over. "No one's gonna find her if we handle it now." The van went silent. Slim clenched his jaw. "You mean?" Rust didn't say it outright, but he didn't need to. The weight of his words settled over the group like a heavy stone. Vinny sighed, shaking his head. "No, too messy. We don't need the extra heat." Rust scoffed. "You really want to take that chance?" Grady smirked, leaning forward slightly. "I say we do it clean. Quick. She's already halfway there anyway." Naomi stayed completely still. Vinny exhaled again, slower this time. "We're not killing her." His voice was final. "We don't need the trouble. We leave her here, middle of nowhere. She won't make it far." Rust didn't argue, but his jaw tightened. He wanted her dead. Slim let out a slow breath, like he had been holding it in. "That's it? We're just leaving her?" Vinny gave him a pointed look. "Unless you want to be the one to pull the trigger." Slim hesitated. Naomi saw it in his face. He wasn't built for that kind of decision. Grady let out a disappointed sigh, shaking his head. "Fine, but don't come crying later if she shows up again." Vinny didn't acknowledge it. He just motioned to Brick. "Get her out." Brick didn't hesitate. His grip clamped onto Naomi's arm, dragging her toward the back doors. She didn't fight. Not yet. The moment the doors opened, cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp earth and old trees. The terrain was uneven, the dirt broken up by exposed roots and thick patches of brush. This wasn't just some random drop-off. They had planned for this. Brick shoved her forward, and she stumbled onto the rough ground, catching herself before she could hit her knees. Before she could move, Doyle stepped forward, looping a length of rope around her wrists again, pulling them behind her back with practiced ease. Naomi clenched her teeth, watching the others. "You should have stayed quiet," Vinny mused, stepping out of the van. "You're smart. I'll give you that. But smart don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Grady leaned against the van, watching her like she was a puzzle he had already solved. "Shame. Really, you put up a good fight." Slim swallowed hard, his face pale. He didn't step forward, didn't look at her directly. He wasn't like the others. He wanted her gone, but he didn't have the stomach for it. Vinny sighed, rubbing a hand over his face like this was some minor inconvenience. "All right, let's get this done." Rust nodded, stepping closer with a length of duct tape. Naomi tensed, every muscle in her body coiled, waiting for the right second. She wasn't going to let them leave her out here, but they weren't going to make it easy. Doyle's grip tightened on her arms, and Rust yanked the tape forward, just as Naomi moved. She threw her weight backward, slamming Doyle into the side of the van, knocking him off balance just enough to loosen his hold. The moment she felt the slack, she twisted, driving her knee up into his ribs, forcing a sharp grunt from his chest. Vinny reacted instantly. His fist snapped out, catching her just under the ribs, knocking the air from her lungs. The impact sent her stumbling back, but she stayed on her feet, forcing herself upright. Brick was already moving. Before she could launch another strike, his hands clamped onto her shoulders, spinning her around and shoving her down into the dirt. Her arms wrenched behind her, pain flaring through her shoulders as Doyle regained his footing, grabbing hold of the rope. "Enough!" Brick muttered, his voice as steady as ever. Naomi breathed hard through her nose, keeping her expression blank as the ropes bit into her wrists once more, this time tighter, more unforgiving. Vinny let out a long exhale, shaking his head. That was a waste of time. Rust tore a strip of tape and pressed it over Naomi's mouth, his fingers digging into her jaw as he made sure it was secure. "Not so tough now, are you?" She didn't react, didn't give them the satisfaction of a struggle. Vinny turned to the others, already done with this moment. "Let's go." They moved quickly, not even sparing her a last glance as they climbed back into the van. The doors slammed shut, the engine revved, and the tires kicked up dirt and gravel as the vehicle peeled away. The sound of the van faded into the night, leaving Naomi alone in the cold, bound, bruised, and bleeding. But she wasn't dead, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The night was silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the van's engine fading into the darkness. Naomi lay still for a moment, her body aching, her breath steadying as the weight of what had just happened sank in. They had left her bound, gagged, and alone in the middle of nowhere. They thought they had won. They thought she was as good as dead. She rolled onto her side, testing the ropes around her wrists. They had been tightened after her last attempt to fight back, the fibers digging into her skin. The duct tape over her mouth made breathing slightly harder, but not impossible. She focused, pushing aside the pain, the exhaustion, and the frustration. Right now, none of that mattered. Right now, all that mattered was getting free. The ground beneath her was rough, uneven dirt, mixed with patches of grass and scattered leaves. The darkness stretched in every direction, trees swaying gently in the wind, their rustling the only reminder that the world around her was still alive. There was no road, no signs of civilization, no immediate way to call for help. She didn't panic. She shifted slightly, rolling onto her knees, her arms still trapped behind her. The ropes were tight, but they weren't perfect. Doyle had been quick when he tied them, but quick didn't mean flawless. Naomi twisted her wrists, feeling out the tension points, the slight give in the knot. It wasn't much, but it was something. She took a slow breath, pressing the edge of the rope against a jagged rock embedded in the dirt. The fibers didn't snap immediately. It would take time, patience. Every movement had to be controlled, every shift deliberate. She didn't have the luxury of rushing. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the distant sound of something moving in the trees. An animal, maybe. Or worse, one of them coming back to check if she was still breathing. She moved faster. The fibers began to fray. Sweat trickled down her temple, her muscles burning from holding the same position for too long. She twisted again, the rope catching against the rock at just the right angle. Snap! The relief was instant. The pressure around her wrists loosened, and she yanked her arms free, wincing as blood rushed back into her hands. She reached up immediately, peeling the duct tape from her mouth, her skin stinging as it came away. She exhaled, finally able to take a deep, steady breath. She wasn't free yet. Naomi pushed herself to her feet, rolling her shoulders, flexing her fingers to work out the stiffness. Her body was covered in scrapes and bruises, her ribs aching from the blows she had taken earlier. But none of that mattered now. She turned, scanning her surroundings, taking in the landscape. The area was thick with trees, dense enough that she had some cover, but open enough that she could move. The van tracks were still fresh in the dirt, leading back toward the main road. She could follow them, but she knew better. They weren't going to stop running. She had spent her life hunting men like them. Now, they were her mission. Naomi inhaled deeply, her mind already working through the next steps. She needed to find help, to get word out before they could disappear again. The manhunt would already be in motion. The second those roadblocks went up, the authorities would have started tracking their movements. But that wasn't enough. She had seen them up close. She knew what they were capable of. Rust had been the most vocal about getting rid of her, but he wasn't the only one who wanted it. Grady had suggested it without hesitation, and Vinny, despite playing it cool, hadn't argued much. That told her everything she needed to know. They weren't running just to be free. They were running so they could go back to the only thing they knew. Naomi had spent years tracking criminals, understanding their patterns, their mistakes. These men weren't just escaping. They had a plan. They had contacts somewhere, a place to regroup, people who would help them disappear. If she didn't stop them now, they would vanish. And when they reappeared, it wouldn't be as fugitives. It would be as monsters ready to do what they had done before. That wasn't going to happen. She took another breath, calming the storm inside her. This wasn't fear. This was clarity. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to hunt them down, every last one of them. Naomi moved with a calculated urgency, her body aching but her mind sharper than ever. The night air was cool against her skin, the adrenaline still dulling the worst of the bruises that would come later. The thick forest had been suffocating. But now, as she reached the clearing, she could see the faint glow of headlights in the distance, a beacon against the darkness, a road, civilization, a way to turn this around. She wasn't out of danger yet. She couldn't afford to make a mistake now. The prisoners thought she was dead. But if any of them had second thoughts, if they circled back just to be sure, she had no doubt they would finish what they started. She had to move fast. Pushing forward, she stayed just inside the tree line, keeping to the shadows as she scanned the empty road stretching ahead. It was a quiet, two-lane highway, the kind that barely saw traffic at this hour. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for something better. If she wanted to stop them, she needed to get in contact with someone now. The low hum of an engine cut through the silence, headlights cresting over the distant hill. She stepped forward immediately, moving toward the edge of the road, lifting her arms and waving them down. The vehicle slowed, tires crunching against the gravel shoulder, the driver clearly hesitant as he took in the sight of her. Bruised, battered, and standing alone on a dark road miles away from anywhere. The window rolled down cautiously, revealing a middle-aged man, his expression wary but concerned. "Miss, are you all right?" Naomi didn't waste time. "I need your phone," she said, her voice firm but controlled. "Please, it's an emergency." The man hesitated for only a second before fumbling into his pocket, pulling out his phone and handing it over. She took it quickly, her fingers moving across the screen as she dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang once, then again, then a voice cut through the static, sharp and urgent. "This is Special Agent Carter." Naomi exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "Carter, it's Commander Naomi Cole." Silence. Then, the shift in his tone. "Commander Cole? Where the hell are you? We've got every agency in the country looking for those fugitives." "I know," she said, her breath steadying. "And I know where they're going." A pause. Then, "Are you hurt?" "Nothing I can't handle," she replied. There was no time for details. "Listen to me. I was taken by them. I know their setup. I know how they move. And I know they're not just running." Carter's voice hardened. "Explain." "They had a plan before they even broke out," Naomi said. "This isn't about disappearing. They've got contacts, resources. They're not looking to escape. They're looking to regroup." A beat of silence. Then, Carter swore under his breath. "Where are you?" Naomi turned, scanning her surroundings, then spotted a rusted, weather-beaten road sign near the shoulder. "County Road 16, just south of—" "We're sending a team. Stay put." She clenched her jaw. "No. Commander, you need me in this," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "They think I'm dead. That gives us an advantage. I can track them before they disappear for good." Carter exhaled sharply, the hesitation clear. "You're not going to wait for backup, are you?" "You already know the answer to that," Naomi said evenly. Another long pause, then a sigh. "Fine, but you don't go in alone. We coordinate this. I'll check in when I have something," she said. "Naomi," She ended the call before he could argue further, lowering the phone as she turned back to the driver, who was still watching her with a mixture of concern and confusion. Do you need a ride somewhere? Or should I stay here? He asked carefully. Naomi shook her head. No, you should go. But when you get to town, tell the first police officer you see that Naomi Cole is alive, and she's after them. The man blinked, clearly not understanding the full weight of what she was saying. But he nodded quickly, his hands gripping the wheel a little tighter. Okay, I can do that. She handed the phone back, offering a tight nod of thanks before stepping back from the car. The driver hesitated for a moment longer before finally pulling away, his taillights disappearing into the night. Naomi exhaled, rolling her shoulders, feeling the dull ache settle into her bones. She was alone again. But that didn't matter. The fugitives thought they had left her for dead. Now, she was going to make sure none of them got away. Naomi stood at the edge of the road, watching the taillights of the car disappear into the darkness. The world felt quiet for a moment, the wind rustling through the trees, the hum of distant insects, the only sound cutting through the silence. Her body ached from the beating she had taken, her ribs sore, her muscles stiff from the struggle and the long trek through the woods. But none of that mattered now. She inhaled deeply, focusing her mind. The prisoners were out there, and they thought they had won. That arrogance was their first mistake. She turned back toward the woods, scanning the terrain, replaying everything she had learned while she had been in their custody. They had a plan. Something bigger than just running. The way Vinny had handled things, the way Rust and Grady had spoken so casually about getting rid of her, it told her they weren't just desperate men looking for freedom. They were dangerous because they had nothing to lose. But more importantly, they had something to gain. That meant they had a destination. They wouldn't stay on main roads for long. Law enforcement would already be scanning the highways, checking every intersection, every gas station, every stolen vehicle. These men weren't the type to take unnecessary risks. They had a route in mind, a fallback plan, and Naomi had to figure it out before they disappeared for good. She crouched near the side of the road, running her fingers over the dirt where the van's tires had kicked up gravel. They had turned off the main highway back there, heading deeper into the back roads. She knew the general layout of the area. There weren't many places they could go without hitting a town or another checkpoint. If they were smart, they would be heading toward a place where they could get off the grid entirely. There was an old truck stop about 30 miles north, the kind that catered to long-haul drivers, cash transactions, and people who didn't ask questions. If they needed a new vehicle, that would be the place to go. If they were looking to meet someone, it would be a good rendezvous point. She started moving, staying close to the edge of the road, but off the asphalt, keeping to the shadows. She didn't need to travel far, just enough to catch a break, find a ride, and get ahead of them before they had a chance to vanish. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour, her body pushing through the exhaustion until she spotted the faint glow of distant headlights cresting over the horizon. Another vehicle, a truck this time, its rumbling engine breaking the stillness of the night. Naomi stepped forward, waving it down. The truck slowed, the brakes hissing as it rolled to a stop beside her. The driver leaned out, a man in his 60s, his face lined with years of long hauls and hard work. His gaze flicked over her, taking in the bruises, the torn clothing, the sheer determination in her stance. "You in trouble, miss?" His voice was rough, but not unkind. Naomi nodded. "I need to get to the next truck stop. You headed that way?" The man hesitated only a second before jerking his thumb toward the passenger seat. "Hop in." She climbed inside, settling into the seat as the truck rumbled forward. The cab smelled of old coffee and diesel, the kind of scent that clung to everything in these long-haul rigs. The driver glanced at her again, but didn't press for details. "You sure you don't need a hospital or something?" "I'll be fine," Naomi said. "But I appreciate the ride." He nodded, tapping the steering wheel. "Well, you're lucky I was coming through here. Not many folks on this road at night." She didn't believe in luck, but she wasn't going to argue. They drove in silence for a while, the dark road stretching ahead, Nothing but the hum of the tires and the distant call of night birds outside. Naomi leaned back, closing her eyes for just a moment, letting herself focus. She was getting close. By the time the truck stop came into view, she was already calculating her next steps. The place was dimly lit, a few semi-trucks parked along the lot, their drivers likely sleeping in their cabins. A convenience store sat at the center of the lot, its neon sign flickering. A few people milled around near the pumps, a mix of truckers, night shift workers, and drifters. And then she saw it. A black SUV, parked near the edge of the lot, away from the lights. The windows were tinted, the license plate covered in a thin layer of mud. Deliberate. They were here. Her pulse remained steady, but she felt the sharp thrill of anticipation settle in her chest. The driver pulled into the lot, giving her a sideways glance. "This where you needed to go?" "Yeah," Naomi said, already reaching for the door handle. "Thanks for the lift." She stepped out, closing the door softly behind her, scanning the lot as she moved. The air smelled of gasoline and cheap food, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows over the pavement. She needed to get closer, confirm if it was them. If they had stopped here, they weren't planning to stay long. Either they were swapping vehicles, picking someone up, or gathering supplies before moving on. Naomi walked slowly, keeping her movements casual, blending in with the handful of people moving around the lot. She angled her path toward the convenience store first, giving herself a better vantage point. As she passed the SUV, she caught a glimpse of movement inside. Two figures in the front seats. She didn't recognize them immediately, but the posture, the way they were sitting, alert, watching the lot, told her everything she needed to know. Back up. That meant the rest of them weren't far. She kept walking, slipping into the store, stepping behind one of the shelves near the window. From here, she had a clear view of the SUV without being seen. One of the men inside lifted his phone, speaking low. A burner. Naomi's mind worked fast. If they were checking in with someone, that meant they weren't moving yet, which meant she still had time. She exhaled slowly. She wasn't just closing the distance now. She was about to make her move. Naomi kept her breathing steady, staying low behind the convenience store shelf, her sharp gaze locked onto the black SUV through the large glass window. The interior lighting of the truck stop was dim, casting long shadows across the shelves and the floor, giving her just enough cover to watch, without drawing attention to herself. The two men inside the SUV were speaking, their silhouettes shifting as they gestured with tense, deliberate movements. Something was wrong. They were arguing. She couldn't hear them from this distance, but she didn't need to. Their body language said everything. Frustration, urgency, barely restrained anger. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head, slammed his fist against the dashboard, while the other, leaner with a long scar running down his cheek, threw up his hands in frustration before shoving the door open and stepping out. Naomi tensed. The scarred man didn't look back as he shut the door behind him, muttering something under his breath before adjusting his jacket and striding toward the far end of the lot. He was walking with purpose, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Whatever they had been arguing about, it was enough for him to step away in the middle of a high-stakes escape. And that meant he was vulnerable. She glanced back at the SUV. The stocky man was still inside, leaning forward, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his head lowered slightly. He was either brooding or making a call. Either way, he wasn't moving yet. The rest of the fugitives were nowhere in sight. This was her chance. Naomi slipped back toward the side exit of the store, moving quickly but not rushing. She pushed open the door without a sound, stepping into the cool night air and immediately falling into step behind the scarred man, keeping a fair distance but never losing sight of him. He didn't seem to notice her. His posture was stiff, shoulders hunched slightly, his pace quick but uneven, as if his frustration was overriding his instinct to stay cautious. He passed the parked semis, weaving between them, heading toward a row of old storage containers stacked near the edge of the lot. Naomi's pulse remained steady as she followed, slipping between the shadows, her footfalls silent against the cracked pavement. The farther he went, the more isolated the area became. The truck stoplights barely reached this far, leaving only the dim glow of distant street lamps and the occasional flicker of passing headlights from the highway. The sound of the busy lot faded behind them, replaced by the low hum of crickets and the rustling of dry leaves caught in the wind. Naomi's fingers curled slightly, her body prepared to strike. Then, suddenly, the man stopped. He turned his head slightly, listening, his body tense. Naomi froze, her breathing shallow. His shoulders shifted as if he was debating something, but after a moment, he shook his head and kept walking, shoving his hands into his pockets. She let him move ahead another few steps before she started again, keeping herself angled slightly to the left, her eyes scanning for the right place to make her move. He was walking toward the storage containers, probably using them as cover while he figured out his next step. But Naomi wasn't going to give him that chance. She picked up speed, closing the gap between them. Just as he reached the edge of the first container, she struck. Her arm shot forward, wrapping around his throat in a tight, practiced hold. At the same time, she used her momentum to twist, sweeping his leg out from under him and driving him backward. His reaction was instant. He let out a strangled curse, hands snapping up to claw at her grip. But she was already shifting her weight, forcing him off balance. They hit the ground hard, but she stayed on top, keeping him pinned as she tightened her hold. He thrashed, trying to throw her off, but he was panicking now, his movements too wild, too unfocused. Naomi kept her grip steady, pressing down just enough to keep him gasping for breath, keeping him conscious, but too weak to fight back. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she murmured, her voice low and controlled. The man struggled, his body twitching as he tried to buck her off, but his strength was fading fast. She let up slightly, just enough to give him room to wheeze in a breath. "Where are the others going?" she asked, keeping her tone even. The man coughed, his body still tense, but she could feel the hesitation creeping in now. He wasn't the leader. He wasn't the planner. He was following orders, just like the rest of them. Naomi shifted her grip, pressing her knee against his chest. "You're already caught," she said. "If you think Vinny's gonna come back for you, you're even dumber than you look. You tell me what I need to know, and maybe you don't go back to prison with broken ribs." The man let out a pained grunt, his fingers twitching against the pavement. He was weighing his options, trying to decide if he had any real way out of this. She could see the moment he made his decision. He exhaled sharply, tilting his head just slightly, and muttered, "They're heading south." Naomi narrowed her eyes. "Where?" "Safe house. Some guy Vinny knew from before," he wheezed. "They were supposed to meet up there and disappear. Get new IDs, new everything." Naomi's mind worked fast. If they had a contact lined up, then she was already running out of time. She needed to move before they could fully disappear into whatever network they had waiting for them. She adjusted her grip one last time, pressing down hard enough to make his breath hitch. "Give me a name." The man coughed, shaking his head. "I don't." She pressed harder. "Collins," he choked out, his voice strained. "Some guy named Collins. That's all I know." Naomi held him there for another second, memorizing every detail of his expression, his breathing, the way his pulse hammered beneath her grip. Then, without another word, she slammed her elbow against the side of his head, knocking him out cold. She exhaled, standing up, shaking out her fingers as she looked down at his unconscious form. 1 down, 7 to go. She turned back toward the truck stop, her mind already moving a step ahead. She had a name now, a direction, a lead. The hunt wasn't just closing in anymore. It had begun. Naomi crouched beside the unconscious man, her breath steady as she quickly searched his pockets. A cheap burner phone, a folded-up map with some locations circled, and a switchblade. She pocketed the phone and the map, but left the knife. She didn't need it. Her eyes flicked back to the truck stop lot, scanning for movement. The black SUV was still parked near the edge, its driver tense, shifting in his seat. He hadn't turned the engine over yet, but something about the way he kept looking toward the convenience store told her he was growing uneasy. She had to move fast. Flipping open the burner phone, she scrolled through the call log. Several recent outgoing calls, mostly to numbers she didn't recognize, but one stood out: C. Collins. Their contact. She made a mental note of the number before dialing a secure line. The call connected almost immediately. "Tell me you have something." Carter's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "I have more than that," Naomi said, keeping her tone low as she moved away from the unconscious man, slipping deeper into the shadows. "One of them is down. Another is still in the lot, but he's getting suspicious. I found a burner phone on him. There's a number labeled C. I'm betting it's their contact." Carter swore under his breath. "Collins, that's my guess. They're moving south to meet him. If we can get a trace on this phone, we might be able to pinpoint his location before they do." "I'll get our tech team on it," Carter said. "Where's the one you took down?" "Out cold by the storage containers behind the lot. He's not going anywhere, but we'll need someone to pick him up before he wakes up." "Sending local units now," Carter replied. "But listen to me, Naomi. Do not engage the second guy alone. We've got people moving into position. Wait for backup." Naomi's eyes remained locked on the SUV. The man inside was shifting, his posture rigid, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He knew something wasn't right. "That's not an option," she said. "If he leaves, we lose them again. He'll warn the others, and they'll disappear." Carter exhaled heavily. "I don't like this." "You don't have to," she said. "Just be ready." There was a pause on the line. Then Carter spoke again, more measured this time. "All right. I've got teams heading toward your location. Give me something to work with." Naomi quickly checked the phone's location settings. It was an old model, but she found what she needed. Phone's last ping was near a place called Mason Ridge. Looks like they were checking in regularly. "That could be the meeting point. That's nearly 40 miles south of you," Carter muttered. "That tracks with what we've been piecing together. If that's their safe house, they'll try to get there by morning." Naomi's grip tightened around the phone. "Then we don't have much time." Carter's tone hardened. "Naomi, listen. If you take this guy down, do it clean. We need him talking." "Understood." She ended the call before he could say anything else. She pocketed the burner phone and took one last glance at the unconscious fugitive before slipping back toward the truck stop lot. The SUV's driver was still there, still shifting in his seat, but now he was gripping the steering wheel tighter, glancing toward the store again. He was about to make a move. Naomi inhaled slowly, muscles coiled, mind sharp. The authorities were closing in. The manhunt was officially in motion. But first, she had to stop this one before he could warn the others. Naomi stayed in the shadows, her breath steady, eyes locked on the black SUV. The man inside had shifted again, his fingers tapping erratically against the steering wheel, his gaze darting from the convenience store entrance to the dimly lit parking lot. He could feel something was off. She watched as he pulled out his phone, dialing quickly. If he was calling one of the others, the moment he got an answer, they would know something was wrong. She couldn't let that happen. Without hesitation, she stepped out of cover, striding toward the SUV with controlled purpose. The driver's head snapped toward her, eyes narrowing as he caught sight of her in his peripheral vision. For a split second, confusion crossed his face. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be dead. Then realization hit. Naomi saw the panic in his eyes just as he dropped the phone, his hand flying to the gear shift. She lunged. Before he could throw the SUV into drive, she yanked the door handle and ripped it open, her other hand darting inside to grab his jacket. He let out a strangled curse, twisting his body away. But she was faster. She dragged him halfway out of the vehicle before he managed to kick out, his boot catching her in the thigh. It wasn't enough to knock her back, but it was enough to loosen her grip. He tore free and bolted. Naomi didn't hesitate. She sprinted after him, her muscles burning with exhaustion, but her mind razor-focused. He was fast, but he was running on fear, not strategy. His boots slammed against the pavement as he cut between parked semi-trucks, trying to lose her in the narrow gaps. She was gaining. He threw a glance over his shoulder, his breathing ragged. His mistake. Naomi pushed harder, closing the gap between them. She angled her body, anticipating his next move before he even made it. He veered left, toward the edge of the lot, where the ground dipped into a drainage ditch. She lunged again, this time tackling him mid-stride. They hit the ground hard, rolling over the uneven gravel. He tried to twist out from under her, throwing a wild elbow toward her ribs, but she blocked it easily, using her momentum to shift her weight and pin him down. His breathing was erratic, his body still thrashing beneath her, but he was losing energy fast. Naomi grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply behind his back, forcing a pained grunt from his throat. "You done?" she asked, her voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "Get off me!" he spat, still struggling. Naomi pressed her knee into his back, tightening her grip. "You run again. I make sure you don't walk out of here." The fight drained out of him. He wasn't trained. He wasn't built for this. He was just another violent coward who had spent too much time hiding behind people stronger than him. Naomi shifted, reaching into her pocket and pulling out the burner phone she had taken from the first suspect. She flipped it open and dialed. Carter answered on the first ring. "Tell me you got him." Naomi glanced down at the man beneath her, his breath coming in short, defeated gasps. "Yeah," she said. "One more off the list." Carter exhaled heavily. "Good. Local units are 5 minutes out. You holding him?" "He's not going anywhere," she said, tightening her grip on his wrist for emphasis. The fugitive let out a muffled grunt of pain. "Then sit tight," Carter said. "We're locking this down now." Naomi nodded, though Carter couldn't see it. "The others will know something's wrong soon," she warned. "If we're going to catch them before they disappear, we need to move now." "We will," Carter assured her. One by one, Naomi ended the call and exhaled slowly, glancing down at the man pinned beneath her. He wasn't struggling anymore. He was listening. Good. She wasn't done yet. The hunt continued. Naomi didn't move as she waited for the approaching sirens, her knees still pressing into the fugitive's back, keeping him pinned. He had stopped struggling minutes ago, his breath coming in ragged bursts as he realized he had nowhere to go. He was trapped, and worse, he was alone. The others had left him behind, whether they meant to or not. That was the first crack in his confidence. "You're lucky I got to you first," Naomi said evenly, her voice low but deliberate. "The others wouldn't have waited to see if you made it out. They would have left you bleeding in the street." He didn't respond, his face half buried in the gravel, his jaw clenched tight, but his fingers twitched slightly against the pavement. A subtle tell. He was listening. She let the silence stretch for a few seconds, then leaned in slightly. "You think Vinny's going to wait around for you?" she murmured. "Think he's going to risk coming back for you now that he knows we're closing in?" Still nothing. Naomi exhaled slowly. "I already know about Collins. I know you were meeting him. I know this wasn't just about running, and I know you're running out of time." She adjusted her grip slightly. Not enough to let him up, but just enough to make it clear she wasn't going to leave him in the dirt forever. "But I need more than a name. You tell me where they're going next, and maybe I make sure you don't take all the blame for what happens next." The fugitive's breath hitched slightly. He was trying to hold on to some sense of control, but he wasn't like the others. He wasn't the mastermind. He wasn't the muscle. He was a follower. And now, for the first time, he had no one to follow. The sirens were getting closer. "You don't have much time to decide," Naomi said. "Once the cops take you in, you're just another number. No deals, no leverage, just another fugitive caught in the net. But right now, you still have a choice." His jaw worked, his breathing shallow. He was still debating, still trying to figure out if he could talk his way out of this. Naomi didn't give him the chance. "You think the others aren't already turning on each other?" she continued. "They know we're coming. They know we're not stopping. The only thing you have left is what you can give me right now." Another pause. Then, finally, his fingers twitched again. "They're not staying with Collins," he muttered, his voice hoarse from the chase. That was just the first stop. Naomi narrowed her eyes. "Go on. They're splitting up." His words came out in a rush, like he had decided all at once that it wasn't worth holding on to anymore. "Vinny and Rust are taking a car and heading west. Grady and Brick are meeting someone else, someone outside the city. The others were supposed to lay low until things cooled off. Naomi's grip on his wrist didn't loosen. Where? The fugitive hesitated, but only for a moment. A cabin, near the state line. Vinny had it set up before we even got out. Naomi filed the information away, her mind already working. If they had planned multiple stops ahead of time, it meant they had a full support network, people willing to take risks to keep them hidden. That meant they weren't just dealing with fugitives anymore. They were dealing with an operation. The first set of red and blue lights flashed against the pavement as a police cruiser skidded to a stop nearby, its doors flying open. Naomi straightened, yanking the fugitive up with her, keeping a tight grip on his wrist as the officers approached, weapons drawn. "Got one for you," she said, nodding toward the fugitive as she stepped back, letting them take over. "He's got plenty to share." One of the officers moved in immediately, securing the suspect in cuffs, while the other kept his focus on Naomi. "You all right, ma'am?" She gave a curt nod. "I'm fine, but I need a secure line now. We don't have much time before the others move again." The officer nodded, already reaching for his radio. Naomi took a deep breath, stepping back as the fugitive was hauled toward the waiting cruiser, his face pale, his confidence shattered. The net was closing, and she was going to be there when it finally snapped shut. Naomi stood just outside the police cruiser as they secured the fugitive inside, his head tilted down, shoulders slumped in quiet defeat. His panic had passed. Now, reality was settling in. He had talked, and there was no taking it back. Whatever loyalty he had to the others had crumbled the second he realized he was alone. But Naomi wasn't focused on him anymore. Her mind was already ahead, thinking about the ones who were still free. She pulled the burner phone from her pocket and flipped it open, scrolling through the call log one more time. Collins. That was the key. If she could pinpoint his exact location, she could cut off their only reliable support before the fugitives even reached him. The man in the cruiser had given her useful intel, but there were still missing pieces. The officer she had spoken to earlier approached, radio in hand. "Your contact's on the line," he said, holding it out to her. Naomi took it without hesitation. "Carter." His voice came through immediately, tense but focused. "Tell me you got something." "They're splitting up," she said. "Vinny and Rust are heading west. Grady and Brick are meeting someone outside the city. I need eyes on the roads now." "We're already moving," Carter assured her. "State troopers have checkpoints going up. We've flagged all major exits, and we've got a federal task force monitoring highways. They're not getting far." "They won't use the highways," Naomi said. "They'll take secondary routes. Stay off the radar. If we're going to catch them, we need to be ahead of them, not chasing their tail." Carter exhaled sharply. "We've already got aerial surveillance scanning remote areas, but it's a lot of ground to cover. The sooner we narrow it down, the better." Naomi's fingers tightened around the burner phone. "I might have a way to do that." A pause. Then Carter's voice hardened. "Talk to me." She glanced back at the police cruiser. The fugitive inside was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He had given up information already, but she could feel it. There was still more. "I need 5 minutes alone with him," she said. Carter sighed. "Naomi, we have procedures." "We don't have time for procedures," she cut in. "He knows more than he's saying. He's scared. He'll talk if I push him the right way." Another pause. Then, begrudgingly, "Make it quick." Naomi handed the radio back to the officer, then stepped toward the cruiser. The fugitive barely moved as she opened the door, sliding onto the seat beside him. He didn't look at her, his gaze locked on the dashboard. His breathing was slow, but his hands were twitching against his lap. "You're not done yet," she said evenly. He exhaled through his nose. "I told you what I know. You told me what you thought would get you out of this faster." Naomi corrected. "But you left something out, something important." Silence. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Vinny trusted Collins enough to make him their first stop. That means they didn't just need a safe house. They needed something else. What was it?" His fingers twitched again. "A tell. You can either give me the answer now," Naomi continued, "or I let Carter handle you the way he handles people who waste our time." She let the words hang for a moment, then added, "And trust me, you won't like that." The fugitive swallowed hard, his body stiff. Then, finally, he broke. "New papers," he muttered. "Collins has someone who can set them up with IDs, get them past state lines. That's why they were splitting up. Easier to disappear in smaller groups." Naomi's pulse remained steady, but she knew this was big. If Collins was handling new identities, then this wasn't just a safe house. It was an entire network designed to keep fugitives hidden. And that meant Collins wasn't just a contact. He was a player in this game. She pressed further. "Where is he?" The fugitive hesitated. Then, with clear reluctance, he muttered, "Farmhouse, near Millhaven. That's where they were meeting him first." Naomi committed the name to memory. Millhaven was an old rural town, mostly farmland, easy to hide in, with long roads leading to nowhere. If they had set up an operation there, it meant they had been planning this long before the escape. She nodded, then reached for the door handle. "You did one smart thing tonight," she said as she stepped out. "Try not to ruin it." She shut the door behind her and immediately reached for the radio. "Carter," she said, her voice sharp. "I have a location. Millhaven. They're heading to a farmhouse there." A short silence. Then, "We'll move on it now. You staying put?" "You know the answer to that," Naomi said. Carter sighed. "You're impossible." She smirked slightly. "You're welcome." She tossed the radio back to the officer, then turned toward the nearest police vehicle. The net was tightening. The hunt was entering its final phase. Collins thought he was about to set these men free. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. Naomi sat in the front seat of the police vehicle as it sped down the back roads toward Millhaven, the tires kicking up gravel, the radio crackling with updates from the units moving into position. The farmhouse wasn't far now, less than 20 minutes, if the roads held up. She stared ahead, her fingers tapping lightly against her thigh, her mind already ahead of where they were going. The farmhouse wasn't just a safe house, it was a hub, a place where Collins was setting up fresh identities, new papers, a way for the fugitives to vanish before the net fully closed around them. But now, the net was closing faster than they had planned. Carter's voice came through the radio again. "All units, we have confirmation of 2 fugitives inside the property. We're holding position until we have visual on Collins." Naomi exhaled slowly. That was the right move. If they stormed in too soon, Collins might escape, and if he got away, the entire network could scatter before they could be taken down. This wasn't just about arresting 2 fugitives. This was about shutting down the entire operation. She grabbed the radio. "How many exits does the farmhouse have?" A different voice answered, one of the tactical team leaders. 2 primary exits, front and back. There's also a barn on the property, likely connected by an underground tunnel. If they try to run, that's where they'll go. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly. "Then we need to block that off before we make our move." "We've got a team moving into position near the barn now," the officer confirmed. The headlights of their vehicle cut through the darkness as the road curved, revealing the silhouette of the farmhouse in the distance. The structure sat back from the road, partially hidden by tall fields and surrounded by thick patches of trees. A dirt driveway led up to it, and in the dim moonlight, Naomi could see the outline of an old truck parked near the barn. "That's their vehicle," she muttered. Carter's voice came through again. "Hold positions. We need to confirm Collins is on site before we move." Naomi didn't argue. They needed this to be clean. She scanned the property, noting movement near the front porch. A man was stepping outside, lighting a cigarette, his posture relaxed but wary. She recognized him immediately. Rust, one of the 2 men inside. Another shadow moved near the barn. This one larger, slower. Brick, 2 of the most dangerous men in the group. Naomi's muscles tensed slightly. If they had been the ones to make it here, then Collins must have been expecting high-risk clients. That meant the operation at the farmhouse wasn't just small-time forgery. It was something more. The radio crackled again. "We have confirmation. Collins is inside." Naomi inhaled slowly. "Then we move now." The response was immediate. "Go! Go! Go!" Flashing lights burst through the darkness as tactical units surged forward, engines roaring as multiple vehicles tore up the dirt road toward the house. Rust barely had time to react before shouts rang out. "Hands up! Get on the ground!" Naomi was already moving, throwing open the door of the police car and hitting the ground running. Rust reached for his waistband, but before he could pull a weapon, a red laser sight cut across his chest, and he froze. "Don't be stupid!" one of the officers barked. He hesitated for half a second, then slowly raised his hands. Naomi didn't stop. Brick was already moving, sprinting toward the barn, his massive frame barreling through the darkness. He was going for the tunnel. "Stop him!" Naomi shouted, pushing harder, her legs burning as she closed the distance. Brick didn't slow. He was almost to the barn, his heavy boots kicking up dirt and gravel. If he made it underground, tracking him would be a nightmare. Naomi reached for her sidearm, but before she could fire, another shot cracked through the night. A single, precise round. Non-lethal. Brick's leg buckled beneath him as he stumbled, losing momentum just before he could reach the barn door. Naomi lunged, slamming into him just as he tried to recover. The impact sent them both crashing to the ground, dust kicking up around them. Brick roared, twisting beneath her, trying to shake her off. But Naomi's grip was already locked in. She used his weight against him, forcing his arm back at an angle that sent sharp pain through his shoulder. "You're done," she said, her voice calm, controlled. Brick snarled, his breath ragged, but he didn't fight her anymore. The weight of approaching footsteps signaled the arrival of backup. Two officers grabbed Brick, pulling him the rest of the way down, securing cuffs around his wrists. Naomi exhaled, rolling her shoulders as she stood. The farmhouse was already swarmed with law enforcement. Rust was on the ground, restrained, his expression a mix of frustration and resignation. Inside, officers were dragging Collins out, the man's face pale as he realized exactly how badly things had fallen apart. The operation at Millhaven was over. Naomi turned toward Carter's approaching SUV as he stepped out, arms crossed. "You just can't help yourself, can you?" She smirked. "You love it." Carter sighed, but didn't argue. "Collins is in custody. That means we can start digging into his network. If he's been providing fake IDs, safe houses, and resources, he's been working with more than just this crew. This might go deeper than we thought." Naomi nodded. "Then we dig." Carter watched her for a moment. "You should take a break. Let us process this." She shook her head. "Not until the rest of them are locked up." Carter sighed again. "I figured you'd say that." He turned toward the farmhouse, rubbing his jaw. "We got 2 more down. That leaves 4 still running." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. Not for long. Naomi stood near the edge of the farmhouse porch, watching as officers secured the scene. The raid had gone smoothly. 2 fugitives down, their main contact in cuffs, and a table full of evidence waiting to be analyzed. But it wasn't over. 4 were still out there, and now, with Collins taken, they would be desperate. Desperation made men reckless, and reckless men made mistakes. She intended to be there when they did. Carter walked up beside her, his expression unreadable as he watched the last of the officers load Collins into a cruiser. "We've already started processing him," he said. "Not talking yet? But he will." Naomi didn't doubt that. Collins wasn't the kind of man built for this level of pressure. He had spent his life helping criminals escape, not getting caught himself. Now, his whole network was on the verge of collapse. And if she knew anything about men like him, it was that he would do whatever it took to save himself. She stepped off the porch, her gaze flicking toward the barn where agents were still sweeping for evidence. "I want to be in the room when he breaks." Carter gave her a knowing look, but didn't argue. "Let the feds process him first. We do this by the book." Naomi didn't respond. There was no need. They both knew she wasn't about to wait for bureaucracy to catch up to reality. The clock was ticking, and every second they wasted was a second the others used to slip further away. Inside the farmhouse, agents were combing through paperwork, burner phones, and laptops spread across a table cluttered with documents. She skimmed a few of them, noting the level of detail. Collins had been more than just a contact. He had been planning this for longer than they realized. Fake passports, financial transfers, mapped out travel routes. This wasn't just about hiding 8 men. This was an entire network. One designed to make people disappear permanently. He wasn't just helping them, she muttered, flipping through a list of names and numbers. He was running an operation. Carter exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Which means we just cut off more than one client. Naomi's jaw tightened. And if that's the case, Collins isn't just scared of us. He's scared of who else might come looking for him. That was leverage. An hour later, Naomi sat across from Collins in a dimly lit interrogation room, the air thick with tension. His hands were cuffed to the metal table, his once careful composure cracking around the edges. He had been quiet so far, playing the role of the man who still had options. But Naomi knew better. "You already know how this goes," Carter said from beside her. "You keep your mouth shut. We bury you. You cooperate. Maybe you walk out of this with a deal." Collins let out a slow breath, staring at a spot on the table. "I don't know anything." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "That's interesting, considering we just raided your operation and found enough evidence to put you away for the next 20 years. His jaw clenched. He was starting to feel it now, the weight of what was happening, the realization that his empire had just burned to the ground. She leaned forward slightly. "You weren't just a stop along the way. You were the fail-safe, the one they trusted to get them over the finish line. And now, that's gone. So tell me, Collins, where do they go now?" He hesitated, but Naomi could already see the answer forming in his head. The wheels were turning, the calculations shifting. He was trying to decide if he could outplay this, if there was still a move left on the board. "You think they won't throw you under the bus?" she continued. "Vinny isn't the type to stay loyal. If he thinks cutting you loose buys him more time, he'll do it without a second thought. If he hasn't already." Collins's fingers twitched against the table, barely noticeable, but enough. Naomi pressed just a little harder. "You don't have to go down with them. You give us what we need. You walk out of this alive." The silence stretched. Then, finally, Collins let out a slow breath. "They were supposed to call me when they got close to the border," he muttered. "I don't know if they still will, but that was the plan." Carter immediately signaled for one of the agents outside the room. "Get a trace on all recent contacts. If Vinny or any of the others call, I want it live." Naomi kept her eyes locked on Collins. Where were they going to cross? He exhaled sharply. "Old smuggling route near the western state line. It's off the main roads. Quiet. Cops don't check it often." Naomi memorized the location instantly. It made sense. If they had a contact helping them there, they could be out of the country before sunrise. She stood, sliding her chair back with a controlled movement. "Then that's where we're going next." Somewhere far from Millhaven, deep in the woods near the border, Vinny paced beside a stolen sedan, his expression tight with frustration. Grady sat on a nearby rock, flipping a knife between his fingers, his gaze sharp and unreadable. "You sure Collins is still good?" Vinny's jaw clenched. "He better be. We don't have many options left." Brick and Rust were gone. The farmhouse was compromised. Collins hadn't answered his last few calls, and that silence was making Vinny restless. Grady smirked slightly. "We could always change plans, find a new route, maybe ditch the others while we're at it." Vinny shot him a sharp look, but he didn't argue. They were running out of time. They just didn't know how close Naomi was getting. The dirt road stretched long and empty, the dense trees lining both sides casting deep shadows under the faint glow of the moon. Naomi stood near the hood of a blacked-out SUV, her arms crossed, eyes scanning the road ahead as the tactical teams finished positioning themselves. The smuggling route Collins had given up was barely more than a forgotten trail, an old bootlegger's pass from decades ago, now used for moving things and people across the border without being seen. If the fugitives followed their original plan, this was their last exit before they truly disappeared. Carter stood beside her, his expression grim as he listened to the last of the radio updates. "We've got teams positioned at both ends of the pass. Air support is on standby, but this area's dense. If they get into the trees, we could lose them." "They won't get into the trees," Naomi said, adjusting the earpiece linked to the other units. "We hit them hard and fast before they have a chance to react." Carter exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "You think they'll actually come through here?" Collins gave them up too easily. If they suspect something's off, they might reroute. Naomi shook her head. "Vinny's out of options. He doesn't have time to plan another escape route, and he doesn't trust anyone outside of Collins. He'll still come through here. The only question is whether they're expecting trouble." She glanced toward the tree line, her gaze sharpening. "And I don't like betting against men who have nothing to lose." Carter didn't argue. A crackle came through Naomi's earpiece. "We've got movement. Vehicle approaching from the north. No headlights." Naomi's pulse remained steady, but she could feel the shift in the air. This was it. The radio continued, the voice clipped and controlled. "One vehicle. 4 heat signatures inside. Moving slow." Naomi stepped away from the SUV, pulling the suppressed sidearm from her holster as she made her way toward the edge of the road. Around her, the tactical units remained hidden, spread out in positions that left no room for escape. The moment the fugitives reached the designated mark, the trap would spring. The sound of the approaching vehicle was faint at first, barely a murmur against the night air. Then, the dark shape of the stolen sedan emerged at the far end of the pass, rolling forward at an agonizingly slow pace. No headlights, no sudden movements. They were cautious, suspicious. Vinny was behind the wheel. Naomi could just make out his silhouette in the driver's seat, his head shifting slightly, as if scanning for anything out of place. Grady was in the passenger seat, his posture more relaxed, but even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders. They weren't comfortable. They could feel the weight of something closing in. "Hold," Naomi murmured into her comms. The vehicle was almost at the mark. 10 more feet. 5. Then, without warning, Vinny slammed the brakes. For a split second, everything froze. Then chaos erupted. The tactical team made their move, floodlights flashing on as vehicles roared onto the road, cutting off both the front and rear exits. Shouts rang through the night. "Hands up! Out of the vehicle!" But the fugitives didn't hesitate. Grady moved first, yanking a sawed-off shotgun from the floor of the car and firing a blind shot through the windshield. The blast shattered the glass, forcing some of the agents to duck back for cover. At the same time, Vinny threw the car into reverse, tires screeching against the gravel as he tried to spin the vehicle around. Naomi didn't wait. She surged forward as the passenger door flew open, Grady diving out, gun still in hand. He twisted mid-roll, firing another wild shot before scrambling to his feet and sprinting toward the tree line. She was already on him. Naomi cut the angle, moving fast, her footsteps silent over the dirt. Grady was big, but he wasn't trained. He ran like a man who was used to chasing, not being chased. He didn't even hear her coming. She lunged, tackling him just as he reached the edge of the trees. They hit the ground hard, his gun skidding across the dirt. He twisted, throwing a wild elbow toward her ribs, but she trapped his arm, locking his wrist into a painful angle. "Don't," she said, her voice calm but sharp. Grady grunted, struggling for a moment longer before she twisted harder, forcing a choked curse from his throat. He went still. Behind her, the road was still chaos. Vinny had abandoned the car, sprinting toward the other side of the pass. Another fugitive, probably Morgan, one of the quieter ones, was moving with him, using the scattered cover of the terrain to disappear into the darkness. Naomi's grip tightened. Grady was down, but this wasn't over. She turned toward her comms. "We've got 2 on foot, moving southwest, cutting through the pass." Carter's voice was sharp in response. "We'll intercept. Do you have Grady?" Naomi glanced down at the man pinned beneath her, his face twisted in pain. "Yeah," she said. "One more off the list." Carter didn't waste time. "Then, get moving. This ends tonight." Naomi exhaled, shoving Grady onto his stomach before snapping a pair of cuffs onto his wrists. He was struggling, but the fight was gone. He knew it was over. She wasn't even looking at him anymore. Her eyes were already on the trees. Vinny and the last of his men were still running, and she was going to hunt them down. Naomi sprinted through the dense undergrowth, her breathing controlled despite the burn in her legs. Vinny and Morgan were still ahead, crashing through the brush like cornered animals. They weren't moving with purpose anymore. They were running on pure survival instinct. But Naomi wasn't just hunting them. She was finishing this. They had stolen days from her, had beaten her, restrained her, dumped her in the woods to die, thinking she wasn't worth finishing off. They had underestimated her from the start. Now, they were out of options, out of allies, and out of time. Her calm crackled in her ear. "We've got them cutting toward the riverbed. Do you have eyes?" Naomi ignored the call. This wasn't for the team. This was personal. She closed the distance quickly, her muscles screaming as she pushed harder. Ahead, Vinny barked something at Morgan, shoving him toward the tree line. But Morgan hesitated. He knew they weren't making it out of this, knew that the moment Naomi caught them, there wouldn't be another escape. Then Vinny turned and saw her, his face twisted with frustration, exhaustion, and something else, fear. "Keep moving!" he snapped at Morgan, then turned fully to face her, hands clenching into fists. He wasn't going to run anymore. He wanted a fight. Naomi didn't slow down. She hit him hard, her shoulder slamming into his chest, driving him backward into a thick tree trunk. The impact sent a deep, hollow thud through the air, knocking the breath from his lungs. But Vinny wasn't weak. He recovered fast, grabbing the front of her jacket and swinging wildly, throwing them both to the ground in a violent tangle of limbs and raw strength. Morgan hesitated nearby, caught between running and helping. Naomi twisted fast, landing on top of Vinny, but he slammed his knee into her ribs, knocking her sideways. He rolled with her, pinning her down for half a second, before she wrenched herself free, delivering a sharp headbutt that stunned him just long enough for her to flip their positions. She didn't hesitate. She drove her elbow into his throat, cutting off his air for a brief moment before slamming a fist into his face. Once, twice, 3 times. The pain in her knuckles barely registered. "That all you got?" Vinny wheezed, blood dripping from his lip as he twisted sharply, his fist driving hard into her side. She felt the impact, but she didn't stop. She grabbed his wrist, twisted it at an unnatural angle, and forced him onto his stomach with brutal precision. He thrashed beneath her, trying to buck her off, but she had him now. "This is for when you dumped me in the woods," she growled, bringing her knee down hard into his back, forcing a strangled grunt from his throat. She didn't stop. "This is for every woman you've hurt, for every person you thought you could get away with breaking." Her fist slammed into his face, again and again and again. Morgan finally snapped out of his shock and rushed forward, but Naomi saw him coming. She rolled off Vinny at the last second, ducking beneath Morgan's swing before driving an uppercut into his gut. He staggered back, gasping for air, but she didn't let him recover. She kicked his knee in, sending him crashing down onto one leg before she delivered a brutal knee to his jaw, knocking him flat. He groaned, trying to roll over, but Naomi stepped on his wrist, pinning him down. Vinny coughed, struggling to push himself up, spitting blood into the dirt. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," Naomi said, shaking out her fists. "Now you're going to wish I had killed you instead." Vinny grinned, despite the blood staining his teeth. "I'm still breathing, aren't I?" Naomi grabbed him by the collar, dragging him upright just long enough to slam his head into the tree behind him. His body went limp immediately, slumping to the ground. Morgan tried to crawl away, but she kicked him onto his back and crouched low, grabbing him by the front of his shirt. "You're done," she said, her voice like steel. Morgan's breathing was ragged, his eyes unfocused. You're not gonna kill us," Naomi exhaled, letting go of his shirt, letting him collapse into the dirt. "No," she admitted, "but I'm gonna make sure you never forget this night." The distant roar of engines signaled the arrival of the team. She had taken her time, but it was over now. Vinny and Morgan were finished. Naomi stood slowly, bruised, battered, but unbroken. She glanced down at the two men groaning in the dirt, their bodies wrecked, their faces swollen with the weight of her vengeance. She didn't need to say anything else. She had already won. The dirt was still disturbed where Vinny and Morgan had fallen, blood darkening the earth beneath them. The fight had been brutal, personal, the weight of everything Naomi had endured culminating in those final moments. She stood over them, her knuckles raw, her breathing steady despite the lingering ache in her ribs. She had won. The sound of approaching vehicles filled the silence, bright beams of light cutting through the trees as law enforcement moved in. Tactical teams fanned out quickly, weapons raised, scanning the perimeter even though the fight was already over. Carter was the first to step out, his gaze sweeping the scene before locking on to Naomi. His eyes flicked between her bruised knuckles and the battered men at her feet. "I take it they put up a fight?" Naomi exhaled, shaking out her hands. "Not much of one." Carter sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before gesturing for the team to move in. Officers swarmed the area, securing Vinny and Morgan in cuffs, hauling them upright despite their groggy protests. Vinny's head lolled slightly, his face swollen, blood still dripping from his nose, but he forced a smirk when Naomi met his eyes. "Hope it was worth it," he rasped, his voice barely holding together. "We'll see you again, Cole." Naomi didn't blink. She took a slow step forward until she was close enough that only he could hear her. "No," she said, her voice cold. "You won't." Vinny's smirk faltered just for a second. Then an officer shoved him toward the transport vehicle, cutting off whatever weak comeback he had left in him. Morgan barely spoke as they dragged him away. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he was forced into the back of another cruiser. He had seen what Naomi was capable of, and unlike Vinny, he had no illusions of ever walking free again. Carter let out a breath as he watched the last of them disappear into the convoy of police vehicles. "It's done," he said, his voice carrying more weight than just the words. "All 8 are accounted for. No loose ends." Naomi glanced toward the horizon, where the sky was beginning to lighten with the first signs of dawn. It felt strange, knowing that after everything, this was truly over. Carter shifted beside her. "We'll make sure they never see the outside of a prison again. The charges alone will bury them. Kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy. The feds are going to make an example out of them." Naomi nodded. "Good." Carter studied her for a moment. "You should get checked out," he said. "You look like hell." Naomi let out a quiet breath, something close to a laugh. "Feels about right." She knew she should be exhausted, should feel the full weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. But instead, she just felt steady, clear. For the first time since this nightmare began, she was in control again. Carter shook his head. "You're impossible." Naomi turned, finally meeting his gaze fully. "And you wouldn't have it any other way." He huffed, but didn't argue. The last of the cruisers pulled away, taking the fugitives to a place where they would never be free again. The forest was silent now, no longer haunted by the men who had tried to use it as their escape. Naomi inhaled slowly, the cool air filling her lungs. It was done. She turned away from the empty road and started walking, leaving the past behind her with every step. Hours later, the precinct was quiet, the kind of silence that only came after something big had finally settled. The chaos of the manhunt was over, the radio chatter reduced to routine updates, and the last of the reports were being filed. The 8 fugitives were officially processed, locked down in separate cells, under maximum security. This time, they weren't just prisoners. They were examples. Naomi sat in the corner office, an ice pack pressed against her bruised knuckles. The pain was dull now, a distant reminder of everything that had happened. The last fight still lingered in her mind. Vinny's arrogance, the desperation in Morgan's eyes, the way they had fought like they still believed they could win. They had spent every second of their escape thinking they were untouchable, that they were smarter, faster, that the system would hesitate just long enough for them to vanish for good. They had been wrong. Across from her, Carter leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her the way he always did after a case like this. "You know," Most people celebrate when they take down an entire fugitive operation, he said. You just look pissed off. Naomi exhaled slowly. Because they almost got away. Carter didn't argue. They both knew it was true. If even one step had gone differently, if she hadn't fought back in the woods, if she hadn't escaped that night, if she hadn't tracked them down herself, 8 violent men would be free right now, slipping into new lives with new names, ready to start over somewhere else. Instead, they were back in chains. And this time, the door was being welded shut behind them. She set the ice pack down, flexing her fingers. They're not walking out again, right? Carter let out a short breath, shaking his head. Not a chance. Their original sentences were bad enough. Now they're looking at life. No parole. Solitary for most of them. Federal escape charges alone would have buried them. But after what they pulled, they'll never see the outside again. Naomi nodded once, absorbing that. Good. They also tightened security for future transfers, Carter added. The way these guys broke out? That's not happening again. Not for them, not for anyone. That was the part that mattered. They weren't just locked up. They were finished. There wouldn't be another escape attempt. No more loopholes. No more hidden contacts waiting to get them out. The entire network Collins had built to help them had been dismantled. Any judge, any warden who looked at their files now would see one clear warning. These men do not get another chance. Vinny had smirked at her in that last moment, thinking he could still hold on to some scrap of control. But the truth was, he had lost the second they were back in custody. Carter tilted his head slightly. You should let this one go, Naomi. It's over. She stared down at her coffee cup for a moment, the heat still faint against her palms. Yeah, she said finally. I know. But she also knew something else. There would always be more. Vinny wasn't the first man who thought he was above the system. He wouldn't be the last. The only thing standing between men like him and the people they hurt was someone willing to hunt them down, drag them back, and make sure they never got another chance to run. She wasn't done. She never would be. Naomi took a slow sip of coffee, letting the quiet settle over her. The fight was over. This fight was over, but there would always be another one, and she would be ready. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day!